Welcome back, Weirds and Weeboos, to the Channel Division Doge, where today we're doing Glacial Trail chimps using the Bomb Blitz. This is actually something you technically voted for. Not that you'd probably remember, because that vote might have been, I don't know, like half a year ago. Yeah, sorry about that one. But hey, I was good on my word, I eventually got around to it. That being said, to be completely transparent, a lot of this video is probably going to be just kind of telling the story about how I went about making this video and all the things that happened in the process, because honestly there's a lot more to talk about there than the actual run. If anything, I have to admit, this is a relatively standard chimps, Glacial Trail run. Just by virtue of the map both being difficult, so I have to try hard, and also having very little space, so I don't really have room for many towers, there's not actually a whole lot going on here. And a lot of the actual parts of the strategy that are quite deep and quite specific are just to do with talking about the Bomb Blitz anyway, so I'd need to get through this long spiel to explain why I ended up using it here in the first place. Oh, also, to be really quick about this, most of you are going to be using this as entertainment and not necessarily as a guide, but if you are using it as a guide, then I guess just pay attention to what's on screen, because I'm just going to be talking general strategy, not super specific, you place this on this round and you target this on this round. Though just to get it quickly out of the way, so long as you do a little bit of targeting micro on round 7 with first last, you can beat the first 2 rounds of chimps on this map using only a single druid, which then allows you to place a ninja on round 8 so that it doesn't freeze in the same rounds that the druid does, and then I usually transfer that into an engineer because I found sentries were the best thing in the game to deal with round 15, and it also means that tower can later be turned into an overclock. So with that out of the way, let's get to the actual meat of the video, the Bomb Blitz. To be brutally honest, there's a good reason why the Bomb Blitz video took so long, and that is because I kind of struggled to make it into a good video. You see, the whole reason I started Unpopular Chimps was because I felt like that was my specialty when it came to this game. That I was always very fascinated in pushing the lowest tier of towers and the most underused abilities in the game. Because a lot of the times, if a tower is underused, it usually isn't because it's just flat out terrible, especially because of how much balance in the game receives. It's usually because it actually has a ton of value that you can unlock if you use it correctly, but using it correctly is either cryptic or awkward or both. That means there's almost always a question of whether it's justified that these towers are underused, or perhaps whether they are genuinely some of the best towers in the game. It's just that most people can't be bothered to deal with their bullshit or don't understand how to use them properly. I do think most of the towers that I cover in Unpopular Chimps fall into one of these two categories. However, at the time that I started the series, I kind of had a list of towers that I wanted to go after, and I'm not gonna lie, that list got pretty short pretty quick. Don't get me wrong, there are still some cool ideas for Unpopular Chimps runs that I haven't done yet, but the ones that I haven't done yet are for challenges that would be extremely difficult, and so I would be very proud of myself if I was able to pull it off, and it would probably be an extremely long-term commitment. Aside from the spectacle of those couple particularly crazy ideas, I must admit that by the time I got around to the Bomb Blitz, I was kind of running out of ideas for Unpopular Chimps. Not that there weren't towers I could still do, but most of the rest of the unpopular towers of the game that I hadn't covered yet were towers that I didn't necessarily take an interest in, or towers that I didn't have much faith really could be good. However, the Bomb Blitz still ended up on my list. For me personally, I didn't find it a particularly interesting upgrade, and I was skeptical that potentially because it was so straightforward, it would be difficult to find the use case for it. Something a bit wackier like the Energizer at least has crazy unique things it does, and you can look up how to abuse those mechanics as hard as possible. But a tower that just deals damage, it's a little bit more awkward finding the specific use case for that, when there's so many other towers that do the same thing. I'd mostly just noticed that whenever I was doing casual runs outside of chimps, I really liked using the Bomb Blitz and was often impressed with just how much work it could do. Sometimes it felt like it was deadlifting runs where it got the proper support, so long as I was just playing on hard or alternate Blons rounds. And yet I'd never use it in chimps. And so I kind of just was curious, well, what if I tried using it in chimps? Is it actually better than I'm giving it credit for, considering it has been impressing me recently in normal casual runs? And I mean, that's not a bad instinct, but in fairness, this is a lot less planned usually than I would be otherwise when I go into a chimps run. When I do an unpopular chimps, I usually have a much more solid opinion on the tower already before I use them. And I already have an idea of what I want to do. The Bomb Blitz was kind of just, figure it out as you go. And maybe that was not a good idea. I hadn't played Cornfield Chimps in years because it was the very first advanced map I beat on Chimps. So I decided I really like Cornfield. Let me go play it again. And let me just redo Cornfield Chimps just for the fun and nostalgia of it, and let me do it with the Bomb Blitz. That sounds fun. And I got it first try. Unfortunately though, I don't think it really made for a great video. It was kinda just a video where I used the Bomb Blitz, but I didn't really have anything to say about it by the end. It did its job, sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that literally any other tower in the price bracket would have done the same job about as effectively, perhaps for even cheaper. And I didn't really do anything fancy in the run. In fact, I was so desperate to spice it up a bit that I forced myself to get an Inferno Ring as my second 5th tier, just for the sake of making the Bomb Blitz, like, a little bit more interesting. But ultimately I realized not only did the Chimps run go a little too smoothly, I'd kind of forgotten how easy Cornfield was. Like, I knew it was one of the easiest advanced maps, but I didn't realize it was that easy. But aside from that, I just had nothing to comment on. And I mean, that's ultimately the meat of these videos. I mean, the gameplay footage keeps it interesting, but hopefully you're here for the commentary. And so if I've got nothing to comment, then there's no point in making the video. So I had to think a little harder. Is there anything about the Bomb Blitz that makes it unique that I need to be showing off more? That was the tough part. You see, you gotta remember that everything I'm saying currently is way back when Core was first released. Go back that many updates and you'll see that the Bomb Blitz is quite a pricey upgrade at 37.8 thousand. That's a lot of money to spend for a tower that effectively just increases the damage of your shots. Now, in fairness, this is cluster bombs we're talking about. These things already explode multiple times with enormous pierce, and so increasing their damage has an enormous effect. This is why outbuffing recursive clusters for the longest time, for nearly the entire game's life in fact, was one of the strongest strategies in the entire game against group balloons, and has only recently fallen off due to reworks to how recursive cluster works. And even still, it's not a bad strategy, it's just not, like, dominating the game anymore. So you'd think that a 5th tier that takes the principles that makes recursive cluster so OP and such a mainstay when it came to literally the entire life of BTD6 with group popping power, you'd think a 5th tier that just takes that and adds a bunch of damage onto it should be pretty damn good. But things get pretty muddy pretty quick. You see, this might sound counterintuitive to say, but this is another tower that has the issue of being too well-rounded for its own good. I've mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again, and I'll probably never be able to escape it in these videos. It's good to have well-rounded towers if they are not going to be part of your final defense, so to speak. But when you have towers that are supposed to be the main source of DPS in the end game, you do not want them to be well-rounded, typically. Because if the tower is balanced properly, they either are going to be way too expensive if they actually do have enough power to solo the entire game, and so they're not going to be feasibly affordable, or if they are feasibly affordable, they shouldn't be able to solo the whole game. There should be something that they're weak to. It's way more cost effective usually to get a tower that deals with these things really well but is weak to this one other thing, and then get some other towers that deal with its weakness. If you instead try to go for well-rounded towers, you'll get a bit of everything, but not enough of everything to beat the last 10 rounds of the game. And that's really awkward to fix, because it's not just one thing you need to fix, you kinda need to fix a bit of literally everything. Yeah, hopefully the problems here are quite self-evident. So again, let's review the Chimps checklist from a few videos ago. The 4 things you really need to beat the last few rounds of Chimps is you need a tower that is extremely consistent and effective at dealing with super ceramics, since of course there's going to be hordes of them and they get faster every single round. You're also going to need a tower that deals with group Moabs, of course, that's the most obvious threat, things like hordes of BFBs and Zongs in 98 for example. You're also going to need a tower that can deal with the hordes of DDTs on 95, and on top of that, the fortified DDTs on 99. There's also the first DDTs on 90 and 93, but so long as you actually have your DDT defense up by them, they shouldn't be a threat. And of course, lastly, you need something that will help you deal with the bad on round 100. Now, on first glance, the Bomb Blitz actually stands in a terrible position. When taken as a base tower, it's pretty good against group Moabs, and it's pretty good against super ceramics. But counterintuitively, It's not good enough to be an answer for the entire game to these things. Maybe group Moabs at a stretch, but super ceramics, no. And that's not because the tower isn't good against ceramics. It's because unfortunately, being a bomb tower, even at 5th tier, even with attack speed boost, it's not that the attack speed is terrible, but it's just not fast enough. If the swarms of super ceramics get big enough, they can just run right through, especially with how fast they are by round 98. And although this tower does very rarely get pierce capped, unfortunately for it, the one round it might get pierce capped is round 98, because that round just has so many ceramics. Considering most of these are also fortified ceramics, which are going to take 120 hits to break open, sure, so long as an explosion hits all the super ceramics, they will be melted. It's not that the Bomb Blitz isn't theoretically capable of doing enough damage to deal with all of them. The problem is, the Bomb Blitz is a bomb tower. It's going to miss. It's going to have moments where it just doesn't hit its bomb at the right time, or there's an extremely short gap, and that short gap is the exact timing at which the super ceramics run right through, and it just doesn't catch them with the explosions. And so, while the Bomb Blitz in theory should be able to deal with every super ceramic in the game, in practice it needs to be paired with Balloon Stall to actually consistently do its job. Which isn't the worst downside in the world. You usually want slows anyway because they're very cost effective. But even still, it's something you need besides the base tower to deal with super ceramics. When it comes to group Moabs, it does struggle with Zongs, but I mean, given enough track length, it's good enough. And in fairness, so far I'm talking without support. With support, absolutely, it definitely deals with Zongs, even fortified Zongs on round 97. But even with support, is it good against DDTs? Not really. The Bomb Blitz is useless against DDTs by default, and it can be okay at dealing with DDTs if it has an MIB effect on it for camo detection, and also getting around the fact that, in case you forgot, DDTs are also considered black balloons, so they're immune to explosions. If you can get an MIB onto a Bomb Blitz, it's okay against DDTs, but it won't be enough to deal with 95, definitely not 99. And then finally, there is the bad on round 100. And yeah, you don't need me to tell you that the Bomb Blitz is potentially not the best option in the game for single target damage. So while this tower does have a leaning towards group damage over single target, overall it still has a bit of the too well-rounded for its own good problem, in that it does help a bit in every category. It can sort of deal with DDTs given support, but it can't really answer them. It can deal with group Moabs up to Zongs, but it needs support. It can deal with super ceramics, but it needs slows. And you might think the bad it can't even touch, but I will give it credit. If you give it the right support, it's unironically not even a bad damage option. I know that sounds like a joke, we'll get back to how the hell this actually can become decent bad damage. But you can see the problem either way. It's got a bit of every category, but there is no category it can solo. And that's usually a terrible thing to have to deal with as a tower. And so this was kind of the conclusion I was coming to at first, about why I couldn't figure anything out to say about it. Because since it wasn't really a handy answer to any one thing on the CHIMPS checklist, and because it didn't really have any outside utility, you know, it didn't have a stun, it does have the ability that triggers when you lose lives, which I think you can probably trigger in CHIMPS with Corvus, but I mean, let's be real, that's not going to be our strat. So ultimately, it didn't really have any special, like, abilities or special utilities that other towers couldn't really abuse. It was becoming really difficult to find, where does this tower go? How do I even show it off? How do I even say, hey guys, this is what you use the Bomb Blitz for? The only thing I could think to zero in on was its synergies. And let's just get those out of the way right now. Most of you already know, but let's just make sure we're all on the same page here. Of course, you run it with Striker Jones, for the 20% extra attack speed, the larger explosions, the everything, especially the ability to hit black balloons. That means you don't necessarily need an MIB to get this thing to hit DDTs, although it's not going to be a DDT defense either way. Of course, Camo Village is going to be a hard requirement because we can't have this thing not able to hit camos. The Alk buff is certainly a lot less effective on this tower now that it already has so much base damage, but that doesn't mean it's not effective. It's still a pretty significant damage boost. So although it's not as crazy as it is on a recursive cluster, it's still well worth getting an Alk buff on it. And to be clear, this is technically not a synergy thing, but the crosspath is 025. This is practically objectively the better crosspath if you're getting Bomb Blitz. Even if we're talking a completely unbuffed alone Bomb Blitz, the top path gives a 20% damage boost, increasing the damage per explosion from 5 to 6, whereas the middle path gives a 40% attack speed boost and also gives you a slight range boost and also gives you faster traveling projectiles that are going to miss less. So you can choose, do you want hitting more targets, having more range, and dealing 40% extra damage, or do you want 20% extra damage? There's basically an objectively correct answer here. The only reason you would ever want to take the top path is that it does have more PS per explosion. But PS is not really a concern with this tower. Not to mention, usually when one crosspath seems almost objectively worse, it's at least because the worse seeming crosspath is extremely effective with buffs. But that doesn't even end up being true here. The faster attacking your Bomb Blitz is, the more it gets out of buffs. So yeah, the middle path is both the path that gives you the most new things to take advantage of, the path that gives you the most DPS increase, and the path that synergizes with giving it buffs the most. This is all before I even mentioned the most significant synergy. And I don't know, maybe I'm missing the mark here, but I feel like this is one of the most under-discussed mechanics in BTD6. Either way, I really feel like no one talks about how broken Striker Jones's level 20 ability is. In fact, I'm not gonna lie, because I barely use this hero, I never realized that Striker Jones actually does reach level 20 without Energizer on, I think, every map in the game. I always thought you needed Energizer to hit level 20 using Striker Jones, but apparently you don't. And the reason why that's groundbreaking to me is because Striker's level 20 is fucking insane. When you activate it, it just gives double damage to every single bomb tower and mortar on the entire screen. Like, just double. Like, oh, I pressed this button and now my damage gets multiplied by 2. To put that in perspective, not only does Overclock cost like 15,000 and Striker costs like 800, and not only is Overclock an ability that can only affect one tower at a time, but Overclock only provides a 67% attack speed boost. This is literally more of a DPS boost than an Overclock, only it's a mass Overclock for every tower on the screen that fires explosives. And you didn't even have to pay for it. That is ludicrous. Now, credit where it's due, I think the reason why this isn't hailed as one of the most broken abilities in the game is, like most broken hero abilities, the uptime is very poor. I don't actually know, but I swear to God, it feels like this might be the longest cooldown ability in the entire game. It takes forever to come back. And of course, it's only temporary. But ultimately, out of all the options in the game, the Bomb Blitz is actually one of the towers that benefits the most from the double damage. So much so that I'm pretty sure on most maps, if you just slap down a Bomb Blitz that has MIB, Alk buff, and a Striker down that's level 20, it can probably solo most maps in the game at least up to 100. Provided you get something to stop the DDTs from just running away with the game, I'm pretty sure you should be able to get to 100 on almost every map with, you know, just a Bomb Blitz as your solo DPS. The level 10 is just that good, the power spike is ludicrous. And if you can combine both the double damage with then an overclock as well on the Bomb Blitz that's dealing double damage, then my god man. The damage output of your Bomb Blitz spikes so high that it can genuinely take on the bad. Yeah, and you thought this tower couldn't deal with single target? Break out the overclock and Striker level 20 and this thing could take out 100 bads. Well, I'm exaggerating a bit. Given enough track lengths, sure, but realistically, maybe that's a bit overboard. So the synergy here is really, really good, and it's not even that hard to set up really. It's basically just use Striker, get a village, get an Alk buff. Pretty standard, honestly. I mean, the overclock's even kind of optional. It's overkill for anything except the bad, so unless you want it for the bad, you don't even really need it. One thing's for sure, this will definitely make 98 a joke. With all that said, that's the build-around strategy here. Of course, we could also get primary training and primary mentoring. I actually completely forgot if I bothered to get that or not in this run. But either way, it's kind of inconsequential for anything but range. Primary training just gives range and extra PS, but it already has enough PS on its own. Primary mentoring is more range, projectile speed, and faster abilities, but we don't have any abilities. Well, we technically have one. The losing lives ability does actually has an invisible cooldown, which I'm pretty sure that primary mentoring does actually make come back faster. But again, we're not using that in this run. Even primary expertise is really just more PS in this context, which we don't really care about. We have more than enough already. So yeah, you'd only get primary training or any of those kind of upgrades on the village if the range actually mattered. So with all that out of the way, where would I go next to try and show off the Bomb Blitz? Well, one of the things that I did learn from the easy cornfield run that I did with Bomb Blitz is that I found it disappointing that Bomb Blitz was so overkill. Once granted all the support it needed, it was cool how it melted 98, but it kind of melted it so fast that, well, the balloons didn't really get anywhere. And that might sound good, but it's actually kind of bad. It kind of makes it harder to figure out when you want to use this tower, because it's showing that I'm spending more money than I need to beat the whole game if this thing is melting 98 with time to spare. But that of course means that then it's really expensive compared to other options, which might not have tore through 98 quite as easily, but probably still would have beaten it for a cheaper price. The only out that I could see is if I could find a map that was really, really short. A map where there was a necessity to absolutely melt round 98 ASAP. You would actually need the ludicrous DPS potential of the Bomb Blitz when paired with Striker Jones's Synergies. And without that ludicrous power spike available to you, you just wouldn't be able to beat the wave fast enough. The problem with that is that obviously implies that I should be playing a difficult map. But let's be frank, bomb towers typically early game are atrocious, and so trying to get them to work on most expert maps is pretty daunting. Even if you find a context in which they're not that bad, they then also have terrible camo detection, which you have to spend even more money supplementing, and also can't even pop black balloons without Striker, but even then Striker isn't high enough level to give them black popping early in the game. The best I could think was potentially Workshop could have been a viable choice, but I still hadn't even beaten normal Workshop chimps at this point, so that seemed quite daunting. Though incidentally, hey, I've done it now. But just as I was about to give up, I did have one more idea way back when, and that was Blons. Yeah, you kind of forget this map exists sometimes because, you know, it's a secret map, so you don't see it on the map select. But I remembered it existed when I was trying to think of short maps, and I mean, this is technically classed as an expert map. It's the shortest map in the game. It kind of checks out. And hey, I haven't done an Unpopular Chimps on Blons before. Sure, why not? And that definitely was a better idea than trying to do it on Cornfield or do it on Workshop, but we still had issues. You see, the Bomb Blitz may have been great against Super Ceramics provided it gets some stall, and it may have been amazing against 98, especially when it gets its power spike, but that didn't change the fact that it had two very devastating weaknesses: DDTs and the bad. And the problem with that is that there aren't many options in the game that are both good against DDTs and the bad. And the few options there are not very cheap. I might be missing some because this is literally off the top of my head, but off the top of my head, the only two 5th tiers I can think of that are both good against the bad and the DDTs is probably the Carpet of Spikes, which in total costs just over 50k, and the Preemptive Strike, which also costs just over 50k in total. Notably as well, whether intentionally or by coincidence, both of these 5th tiers also have rough stepping stones. The 4th tiers before them are not very powerful for their cost, and so it's really hard to survive to be able to afford the 5th tier, not only because it's expensive, but also because the previous upgrades don't do a good job of defending on their own. However, if I couldn't pair the Bomb Blitz with a Preemptive Strike or a Carpet of Spikes, then this would seem basically impossible. I mean, with how ludicrously short this map is, there was no way I was going to be able to deal with DDTs unless I could either insta-kill them with Preemptive Strike, or I could stall them super hard with Icicle Impale. But while Icicle Impale is a more appealing option, it also does nothing against the bad. And when you factor in all the support we have to get for the Bomb Blitz, and the fact that Blons was so short we couldn't just beat the bad with a first strike, because genuinely that wasn't enough damage to first strike it. And yeah, you can see how this run ended up being a bit of a nightmare. Getting to the end wasn't too difficult, but actually beating the end was really tough. I'm not going to say it was impossible. I think it was potentially possible if I found a way to scrounge a little bit more cash and be a bit more stingy in the mid-game. But ultimately, I never really got the run I wanted on Blons, and eventually I gave up on the idea. Fast forward months, and here we are today. To be completely honest, I was considering just ditching the Bomb Blitz idea, because I thought, well, I did say I'd do it, but I didn't have that many good ideas for it, and everything I was trying wasn't working, and you guys asked for it months ago, and you probably don't even care anymore. But just as I was thinking that I didn't have any ideas for the Bomb Blitz video, it was almost fate, I guess, because immediately afterwards, I thought to myself, well, if I'm not going to do the Bomb Blitz video, I don't know, what's the next expert map I want to try on Chimps? Glacial Trail seems like a good pick, and as I was messing around, going for my first run-through, just kind of going in blind, I managed to get to round 95, but I didn't get good enough DDT defense. I thought I'd have more money than I did, and I didn't, and I had to restart. And when I went to reset and ditch my Spirit of the Forest strategy that I was initially going with, that's when it hit me. Wait. This map's actually kind of perfect to show off Bomb Blitz. It's like I said, I need an extremely short expert map. Well, that's what we got right here. There's not a lot of space on this map, and it really isn't long before the Blons are in the end. Well, I suppose technically they spend a lot of time getting to the end, but half of that time is spent in the tunnel where you can't even damage them. In terms of time where they're actually vulnerable, you've got very little time to beat these waves, and so a Bomb Blitz might actually be necessary for round 98. As well as that, the fact that it's quote-unquote too well-rounded for its own good wouldn't really bite it in the ass here, because there was actually a unique challenge I was having on Glacial Trail specifically. Because I'm not used to using these well-rounded towers because more specialized towers tend to be more effective, I was actually having more trouble than I expected on Glacial Trail because of the fact that very mindset kind of gets screwed by Glacial Trail's gimmick. If I do what I usually do and get a really good single target option and a really good, I don't know, multi-target option or whatever, all that happens is the first round that my multi-target option is frozen, my single target option just cracks open all the Moabs and ignores all the ceramics that go running to the exit, and I get overwhelmed and die. Because of the fact that 20% of the time you're playing this map, one of your towers is disabled and there's nothing you can do about it, it kind of encourages you to, instead of having obvious weaknesses that are covered by other towers, when those other towers could be frozen at any moment, it kind of encourages you instead to invest in more well-rounded towers that can still hold their own on rounds where their support is frozen. And that's actually kind of perfect for the Bomb Blitz, because the main two things we're worried about is DDTs and the bad, but they only exist for the final few rounds of CHIMPS mode. For the vast majority of the map, all we have to worry about is Super Ceramics and Group Moabs, which is exactly what this tower is amazing at dealing with, and doesn't really need any help with aside from some minor slows. And conveniently enough, the only type of tower on this entire map that does not ever freeze is of course Ice Monkeys, which can fulfill that very purpose. When it comes to its greatest weaknesses, an Icicle Impale is already a tower I was thinking of getting on this map, and it is the perfect answer to DDTs so that this tower doesn't have to worry about them, leaving only the bad, which, as I mentioned, if you compare this tower with an Overclock, honestly, combined with Strikers level 20, it's not even that bad against the bad. The only flaw in this thinking is that you would need another well-rounded 5th tier to fill in the gaps when the Bomb Blitz is frozen. But that's not even all too much of a problem. It is more cost to our defense, yeah, but I mean, no matter what strategy we're running, we can't use a solo tower defense here. It's Glacial Trail. That won't work. So that was always going to be an issue. And we kind of want our other 5th tier to be another well-rounded one anyway, because I will admit, as much as I do prefer to work with specialist towers whose weaknesses and strengths complement each other, you can also kind of make these all-rounded towers work by just getting another all-rounder tower. Ultimately, while I am making myself use the Bomb Blitz, which probably maybe this would be a bit easier if I wasn't using Bomb Blitz, I'm still not exactly memeing here. I am tryharding a little bit. So I will admit I was boring. I got the Flagship carrier. Sue me, it's just broken in expert maps, you just need to get it. And I mean, it was exactly what I was looking for. A cheaply priced but still extremely effective 5th tier that was well-rounded just like the Bomb Blitz, could hold its own on rounds where the Bomb Blitz is frozen. Hell, it was so perfect, it even kind of leaned the other direction. While Bomb Blitz is slightly better against group targets, the Flagship is actually slightly better against single target, especially if you take the Grapes Crosspath, as the majority of your Moab damage comes from the missiles from the planes, which usually target a single Moab even if they do explode. In every way, it was just the perfect complement to the Bomb Blitz, as well as just happening to be a broken tower in expert maps. You might also notice that very conveniently, it could go on the right side of the screen, where our village is. It might be annoying that this village only gets 2 towers, but those 2 towers are the very 2 towers that need the village buff. It's the Bomb Blitz, and of course, the Flagship. We don't really need anything else on the screen to have camera detection or jungle drums. These are the only 2 things that really need the buff, so as much as it might sting to have so many towers outside the range of the village, Ultimately, this is completely fine, and it would be so wasteful to try and do something like get a ice bridge with Arctic Wind to put like the village in the water to put it closer to maybe get more towers in the range. It's just not worth. With all that said, I think it's past time I talk about how I played around the gimmick of this map, the whole freezing towers thing. As most of you will know by now, the towers freeze every 10 rounds for 2 rounds, which means you can control which rounds your towers are frozen on by controlling which rounds you place said towers. And so obviously it's very important to plan ahead and make sure that you are placing your towers so that you know which rounds they're going to be frozen on, and you know it's okay for those towers to be frozen on those rounds. In fact, this is why it's important in the early game to solo the first 2 rounds with just a single druid, even though you have the money to get a second tower. You want to make sure that the second tower you buy is freezing on rounds completely different to the druid. So I did go into this with a very clear plan, although I messed it up a little bit. Though thankfully I didn't suffer the consequences. The most important thing was, out of my main final DPS towers, I needed to make sure there were no rounds where more than one of them were frozen, and as well as that, I wanted to make sure that for rounds 98, 99, and 100, there would be no towers that were frozen. Well, again, at least no towers that were important for our final defense. Now, Striker, I just want to quickly clarify, is actually considered one of the towers that is very important to our final defense, which might come off as a slight surprise at first, because while his damage output isn't bad, it's certainly nothing compared to the output of the Bomb Blitz or of the carrier Flagship. And I mean, we also didn't bother to get him under the village. But the reason why it's important to make sure Striker is frozen on the right rounds is because while being frozen, you can't even use abilities. And not only have I been talking about how broken Striker level 20 is, but also even his concussive shell. If there's one thing that Striker has going for him, even if you're not getting a whole lot out of bomb or mortar synergy, I would definitely say it's concussive shell. This ability, once you get into level 20, has a ludicrously short cooldown, and yet it has full map range, homes, and mass stuns just about anything in the game for a really long time. Proper micro with concussive shells can really help you stall out and split up rounds to make them as manageable as possible, and have all the threats trickle in at different timings so that otherwise unmanageable hordes of balloons actually get split up into bite-sized chunks. Especially if you throw into the mix a little bit of good timing. When it comes to the tunnel, you can certainly split up balloons by making sure to stun them just as 1 or 2 of them enter the tunnel, so that there's a gap between the Moabs that are sneaking through rather than them all coming through at once. So given that we have 3 towers we really need to keep for the last few rounds of the game, it became pretty clear pretty quickly what we would need. We would need one of them to be frozen on rounds ending in 1 and 2, one of them to be frozen on rounds ending in 3 and 4, and one of them to be frozen on rounds ending in 5 and 6. Meaning by round 97, we would be home free. In fairness, 98 is the first really scary round in the last stretch, but 97 is still a round we have to be wary of. It's typically the easiest round in the entirety of the last 10 rounds of CHIMPS, because it's just 2 fortified zongs which can easily be stalled, and it takes them forever to reach the exit, so you have so much time to deal with them. However, this defense is a little bit lacking in general in good single target, so there is still a threat that potentially, if we get unlucky, these fortified zongs could still be an issue. The only real question was which should be frozen on which rounds. And the answer I came to is that Striker needed to be frozen on 1s and 2s. And that is because I thought it might be important to keep Concussive Shell available on a lot of these sketchy rounds. And so the least threatening rounds, 1 and 2s, were the rounds that I wanted to not have my Concussive Shell available. I thought it was probably best that the Bomb Blitz get frozen on 3s and 4s because I wanted it to be available for 95. Because we had Icicle Impale, we had Striker, and we had a Camo Village, I thought we probably would have no issue on 95, but the one issue I could see is if there was a round where the Bomb Blitz was frozen and the Flagship had to carry instead. Because without MIB, Flagship's DDT damage is actually pretty terrible. And while Striker would definitely help with that, making the Moab missiles sometimes hit their target, it wouldn't be consistent. So while I thought I'd probably just about make it if I was stuck with the Flagship, I should probably make sure that I use the Bomb Blitz as my DDT defense on 95, which lastly just left the Flagship to be frozen on 5 and 6. There wasn't really a specific reason for this one, it was mostly just that was the last slot left. Then again, I said earlier I fucked all this up. So okay, what did I do? Well, honestly, even still recording this now, having already beaten this map, I still keep forgetting how it works when it comes to counting when the end or start of a round is. In other words, I always get confused when I place a tower down, whether it's going to be frozen in 9 rounds or 10 rounds. I know it's supposed to be 10 rounds, but under certain conditions it can be 9, and I think it's something to do with ending a round but not starting the next one yet, but I honestly keep forgetting how it even works, even though I've literally already done this map now. But yeah, long story short, everything got shuffled over 1 round, which was slightly sketchy, but luckily it was just 1 round, so it didn't ruin the whole strategy. It turns out I didn't need Striker for 93, so we were okay on 93, where Striker was still frozen unintentionally. 95 was a little bit sketchy without the Bomb Blitz, and with the Flagship having to do the work instead. It certainly would have been easier with the Bomb Blitz, but as I expected, Icicle Impale is the best counter in the entire game to DDTs, so 95, even though it was killed quite slowly, was still killed quite handily. That left just 97. Which, believe it or not, for as much of a laughingstock of a round it usually is, again, because of how awful the single target was, and the fact that I'd lost my Flagship, which was kind of my best single target option, I actually was sweating a little bit on 97. Again, thankfully these zombs are just so ludicrously slow that you have all the time in the world to deal with them, and I didn't die on 97. But I did actually break a little bit of a sweat. Obviously, what was most important is that yes, even though we'd made some mistakes along the way, I still had all my towers available for 98, 99, and... Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I got a little bit nervous when I realized that I think I placed this Alchemist down that's buffing the Bomb Blitz a little bit early, because I used it to clean up some red balloons, like at the end of a wave at one point, just because I didn't want to restart. But it turned out that I'd placed it down so that now it was going to be frozen on round 100. Now, because this is just a single Alchemist on a tower that already does great without the Alchemist buff, you know, I was thinking it probably wouldn't matter, but I was also worrying to myself, God, if I lose this run because I placed this Alchemist just a little bit too early, I'm gonna tear my hair out. Thankfully, though, the Alchemist ended up being pretty inconsequential, as I had hoped. But on that note, what did we actually do about round 100? Because surely a Bomb Blitz and a Flagship isn't enough to deal with the bad. So for almost every CHIMPS run I do on an advanced or expert map, I will end up doing a little bit of sandboxing just to make sure I'm not going in completely blind. And so I had already done some sandboxing, both on round 95 to make sure I wasn't screwed there, and more importantly on round 100. And what I found is with the defense I was planning, I would need a little bit more help, as I thought. But unfortunately, both of the most effective options I found to fix the situation I was in were both around the same price bracket. Those being, I could either get an overclock and combo that with Striker's level 20 to make the Bomb Blitz do so much damage that it was capable of dealing with the bad on its own, or I could just do the standard thing and get a first strike for about the same price to nuke it once it got low. I tested these out and both of these things worked, although the real run still had me breaking a sweat since in those tests the Alchemist I had wasn't frozen. Both of these options were appealing in their own ways. The first strike was certainly the more safe and certain way to deal with the bad, but it also would provide basically no help on any round except 100, whereas an overclock would actually be helpful on 98 and 99 as well. Not to mention, I kind of already had the engineer down, whereas I didn't already have a sub down. But what got me nervous was the thought that both of these options were about the same price. And while I thought they should be affordable, I thought it might be close. If neither of these things worked, I would need a Spike Storm, but there would be no room on the map to use it. I would have to place it completely off the map and just use the ability, not the tower itself. At which point, it might be able to save me, but it wasn't quite set in stone. So I was getting nervous as I approached round 100. Nervous that the money just wouldn't be there. Only for me to get a pleasant surprise. Not only was the money there, it was more than there. I had enough money to get both a first strike and an overclock and end the game with nearly 7,000 in cash to spare. It felt weird having so much cash to throw around, knowing that I had bought 3 5th tiers this run, but then again, every 5th tier I bought was very cheap by 5th tier standards. The Flagship and the Bomb Blitz both sitting around 27k, and the Icicle Impale at 32k. Not to mention, earlier when I was sandboxing this strategy, I was worried I might need an MIB to make it possible, and in hindsight I'm very glad I didn't waste that money on the MIB, although it's also good to know that even if I did, I probably would have had enough money to beat the game anyway.
And that concludes my Glacial Trail Chimps run. I really liked it, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I already liked this map when it released for its gimmick and its unconventional track design, but at the time I was a bit mixed on it. I found it exciting and new, but also a little bit annoying. And don't get me wrong, yeah, it is a little bit annoying. But I really appreciate it now for how much it makes you actually have to reconsider how you build strategies in this game. I guess that might sound like a very generalized point, but I really do appreciate that because I do think it's pretty rare. I mean, when you look at the maps that exist in the game now, I feel like there really aren't a lot of maps that force you to reconsider how you typically play a normal game of Chimps. There's some level of it going on in just simply playing an easier map versus a harder map, where maybe on easier maps you can get away with greedier, like shorter range towers that do loads of damage for a low cost but are restricted by range or whatever. And then as you get to harder maps, you have to use infinite range towers more, or towers that can move around or be microed more. But outside of that, which isn't necessarily even a map specific thing, more just a how hard is the map thing, I feel like you don't really have to reconsider your strategy a lot when you go to play a new map a lot of the time. And unfortunately, the few times you do, often the reconsidering the strategy part is quite obvious and one note. I really hate to bring this map up as an example because I actually enjoy this map, but I do think it's a good example of what I mean. Look at a map like Moon Landing. For those of you who didn't know, that actually came out the same update as the Mortar came out. So it's no surprise that it's a map made for the Mortar. It's basically an advanced map if you try to play it with just normal towers, but if you use a mortar, the map becomes so much easier, it's borderline beginner. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate having maps that play differently, but a lot of them I feel like end up being like Moon Landing, where it's not that they're bad maps, but the way in which you have to reconsider how you play the game is pretty flat and obvious. It's, oh, this is the mortar map, so we use mortars. But Glacial Trail feels like one of the first maps I've played in a long time, which changes the way you have to strategize around the game, and doesn't just do it in a very obviously skewed way, where certain towers get screwed and another tower very obviously gets all the benefit and you should just use that tower. Obviously some towers got better and some towers got worse, but it feels like everything got shuffled around a bit, to the point where the answers are different, but it's not really an obvious bias one way or the other. The only obvious bias I can see is that generally the more costly upgrades in the game are not really very viable on this map, because obviously anything you throw too much money into, you're just going to be screwed when it's frozen. But even that point doesn't really irk me too much, because while that would usually get under my skin a little, I think that's already kind of a consequence of playing an expert map in the first place, is often you don't have the ability to sit back and save up tens of thousands in cash to get something that costs nearly 50,000. So overall, I gotta say, I really appreciate this map. I can also see why, at least as far as I've seen, people are still relatively indeterminate on exactly how hard this expert map is. I'm not gonna lie, when it first came out, I thought, yeah, everyone's gonna denounce this map as the next Dark Castle, the next not truly expert map. But it seems like, if anything, the opinion seems to average out to it being a rather medium difficulty expert map. As for my personal take, a little hard to say. I feel like this map, for me, was a little bit on the easier end, but I feel like a lot of that is because I feel like this map is very well suited to my talents. I'm very bad at the finicky, like, early game micro and, like, mid-round figure this out, and I feel like I'm very good at the, okay, figure things out in advance and get a good late game defense. And I feel like the main difficulty of this map is obviously the freezing towers constantly makes actually figuring out your long-term defense a lot more tricky. So I guess it kind of depends on your skill set. With all that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.